first off, it is not that easy to get pregnant as we've been led to believe, but I do understand that if that happens and that's not what you want, the consequences are pretty severe. So that's why today's video is my experience of how I successfully avoided pregnancy naturally for 3 years after coming off the pill, and then I used this same method the other way around to conceive when that was our intention to do so. Before I get into the heart of today's video, or the meat of today's video, I just want to do a quick introduction of who I am if you are new to my channel. So welcome, I'm Common Free. I'm an employment relations practitioner and also a business owner, and I'm all about sustainable and conscious living. I'm obsessed with trying to do things as intentionally as possible. On that journey, I came to learn about living in sync with your cycle. I became a massive nerd around all things hormonal health, fertility, reproductive health, living in sync with your cycle, how to live my life and my business in my more feminine energy and with my cycle as opposed to working against it. And here I am now a few years later having implemented this stuff in my life, and I've built up what I think is quite a large bank of information that I have to share and my experience that I have to share. So where to start? If you're watching this video, my assumption is either you're going to come off the pill or you just came off the pill and you're wanting to know where to start. I would like to say that this video can also be used by anybody coming off of other types of hormonal birth control. More or less, it should be the same kind of journey off of it. I did make a video of my journey coming off of the pill, so if you want to watch that, I've linked that in the description box below. I think here's a good place for me to give my disclaimer. So everything that I say in this video is me sharing what I know, sharing my experience, sharing what I've read, sharing what information I have at my disposal in the hopes that it's helpful to other women. However, nothing in this video is advice, or nothing in this video is me trying to tell you what to do with your body. I think it's incredibly important that women be empowered when it comes to that, and I think there's more than enough people telling women what they should and shouldn't be doing with their bodies, so I don't want to contribute to that at all. So when watching this video, please just take what serves you and leave what doesn't serve you. I'd also like to add a little bit of another caution, and that is when I discovered this, when I discovered living in sync with my cycle, when I discovered that I could naturally avoid conception and the pill wasn't my only option, I did have times where I became angry. I became angry that it took me, I think, like 15 years of having, puberty and having a cycle to know this. How had nobody ever told me this? Or why wasn't this common knowledge? Why didn't I know that this was an option from the beginning? So I went through a whole phase of being pretty disgusted that this is not common knowledge. So if you do go through that, I think lots of women when they discover this do. Just like, how did I not know about this sooner type of thing. But then in the same breath, this method, and I have read up about why it's not more common knowledge, and I think it's just important to say that what I'm going to discuss in this video empowers you with information about your body, or it equips you with tools to know more about your body. But it does mean that the responsibility is on you to create an awareness with your body, to create a relationship and a connection to your body, to use this method successfully for whatever purpose you're using it for. So be it to avoid conception or to conceive, or like what I was using it for is in the beginning, was to just be able to understand the feedback loops my body was giving me in terms of my hormonal health. Whatever that reason is that you're using it for, the responsibility is on you to create that awareness. And I say responsibility, but I think a better phrasing of that would say it's a gift. It's an amazing part of this. But that does mean if you abdicate responsibility or you skip some of the steps, like I explained in the beginning of this video, the consequences could be pretty severe. And I think it's wonderful to give back to you the power of knowledge about your body so that you have control over what the potential consequences could be. So I just wanted to say that because a lot of times I get comments like, oh, my friend so-and-so did this and then they got pregnant. I'd like to have a conversation with friend so-and-so to really ask how they did this and then how that pregnancy came about. Because a lot of the time they didn't do this, which resulted in the pregnancy. I'm not saying it's not possible. There's a kind of failure rate for any type of contraceptive, but I'm just saying is highly unlikely. The basics of the fertility awareness method, or FAM, or just fertility awareness. I'm going to give you more details on exactly the technicalities of it and the tools to implement it, but for now I'm just going to give you some general information. I'll also speak of the effectiveness of it, meaning how effective is it in preventing pregnancy, because all contraceptives and all methods of trying to avoid pregnancy, short of completely abstaining, do have a little bit of a failure percentage or likelihood of happening. But with FAM, the amazing thing is that that power is in your hands, and you can kind of determine the risks, or how effective it is will be up to how you implement it, as opposed to the failure of a device. So the first principle of the fertility awareness method, or just general bit of information I would like to put out there, and this one is just vitally important for women to know. I don't understand why I went so long in my life without knowing this. First thing is, you cannot get pregnant every single day of your cycle. It is physically not possible. There is a window in your cycle where you can get pregnant. Now that window may be larger or smaller for some women. That window may move at times in your life. It may move forward, it may move backwards, but it is a small window in your cycle that you can get pregnant. Not the entire thing is not a door. Also, when you're implementing the fertility awareness method, you can decide how big do you want the area around that window to be when you are avoiding conception. And as you're learning how your window is, or when your window is, or how to know when your window is going to open. Women ovulate once per cycle. You can release more eggs during that particular ovulation, but it would be a extreme physical abnormality to ovulate more than once in a cycle. And I'm really speaking about like incredibly rare occurrence, if it's ever happened. So when you ovulate once per cycle, your body is releasing one or more eggs, but usually one, and that's your window. That's your window of when you can get pregnant, is when that egg is coming down and it's waiting to be fertilized or not. That egg coming down once in your cycle lives for about 12 to 24 hours maximum. Now, that does not mean your window is 12 to 24 hours. That doesn't mean that at all. But just putting it into context, if that egg is not fertilized in those 12 to 24 hours, then your window shuts again and you're not able to get pregnant until that window comes around. Now, the reason I'm saying your window is not just those 12 to 24 hours in your cycle is because leading up to your ovulation, your body will prepare the environment for fertilization of the egg. Our bodies are amazing. So your body will create what is, I would like to refer to it as the fertile window. So a few days prior to your ovulation, your body is going to create the perfect environment to keep sperm alive, to wait to fertilize the egg. So essentially your fertile window is where your body is able to keep sperm alive, to wait for the egg to drop, and for as long as the egg is alive before it disintegrates and the window shuts again. Outside of that fertile window, you cannot get pregnant. And the reason for that is the vagina, or the vaginal canal, or just that area, is pretty acidic. Specifically, it's around 3.5 to 4.9 pH. So that's pretty acidic, and sperm cannot survive in that very acidic environment. So outside of that fertile window, when your vagina is very acidic, the sperm will live a couple of hours maximum. Inside of the window, when your body has created a healthy environment for sperm to survive, that sperm can survive for up to about 5 days. And some people's cases, maybe even a little bit longer. So like I said, leading up to ovulation, your body is going to create the perfect environment for sperm to survive until the egg drops, and also to change the sperm so that it can fertilize the egg. And how it does this is through cervical fluid. The other names for cervical fluid is also cervical mucus, but I don't really like the word mucus much, so I like to say cervical fluid. And the other one, which I shudder at, is discharge I'm not going to refer to it as discharge. That just sounds really terrible when cervical fluid is such an amazing, important part of a woman's cycle and such a vital way to know when you can and cannot get pregnant. So in this video, I'm going to refer to it as cervical fluid. Now, cervical fluid literally changes the pH of your vagina so that sperm can survive longer. And like I said, it can survive for up to about 5 days, maybe a little bit longer depending on how much cervical fluid you have or how many days of cervical fluid you have. In my case, the fertile cervical fluid is probably around 4 days, maybe 5 days maximum. That would be my fertile window. So the basics of the fertility awareness method is knowing when is your fertile window, when is it opening, and when is it going to close, and then sex outside of that window means you're not going to get pregnant, sex inside that window means you could get pregnant. When your fertile window closes, so when you have not had sex in a way for sperm to be inside your vagina during the fertile phase and the egg has descended and it has done its kind of 12 to 24 hours of living and not been fertilized, then the window shuts. And when it shuts, the pH of your vagina goes back to being acidic and basically a sperm killer. And also your cervix becomes plugged. So sperm is not going to go through the cervix into your uterus and into your tubes and into wherever else it wants to go to meet up with an egg. This plugging of the cervix is a wonderful function so that if you did have a fertilized egg and it implants and is getting ready for pregnancy, then your uterus is nice and close to make a nice little home for the fertilized egg. If you're not pregnant, it just stops sperm from coming in. So once that window is shut, until it opens back up again, you cannot get pregnant. So what are the basics of the fertility awareness method? The basics of the fertility awareness method is becoming aware of your fertile window and making sure that you don't have sex in a way that sperm enters the vagina during that fertile window, knowing when it closes, and then happily having sex without becoming pregnant when it's closed, and then doing that again for the next cycle. There's one thing that I cannot stress enough. Please do not assume that because your previous cycle you ovulated on day 14, you're going to ovulate on day 14 in your next cycle. That is, maybe you're going to, but maybe not. Maybe your ovulation is going to move sooner or it's going to move later. So please do not count days in your cycle to determine when is going to be your window, when is it going to open, and when is it going to close, because it can and it will move. No matter how regular you are, it will move in your menstruating life. Counting days in your cycle is not the fertility awareness method. If somebody tells you their method of contraceptive is just knowing when they ovulate by counting days, they are using what is called the rhythm method. The rhythm method's effective rate, meaning how likely is it to actually help you prevent pregnancy, is pretty low. It is not a good contraceptive and I would not recommend using it. I also want to strongly caution against this. I will speak about the apps that are used as tools in the fertility awareness method, but I cannot stress this enough. Please do not abdicate responsibility of awareness of your body to an app. The app will use your past data. It will take your previous cycles to make a prediction of when it thinks you are ovulating. But literally, out of nowhere, based on consequences or based on the circumstances that you have in a particular cycle, your ovulation can move forward or it can move backwards, and the app won't be able to predict that accurately because it uses past data. So I would not recommend abdicating responsibility to an app. An app, in my opinion, should only ever be a tool to help you record data, but to not use that as a prediction of when you're actually ovulating or not. So if you follow me on Instagram, you will know that I start every day with posting a picture from my journal of my cycle day, and for information purposes, I have shown in real time, because I literally track my cycle in real time on my Instagram, I have shown times where the app's prediction was very incorrect for my cycle, and I have a pretty regular cycle. Times where my ovulation moved earlier, where I was stressing a lot and it moved a little bit later. And in those times, had I followed the app's recommendation of when it thought my fertile window was, I potentially could have had an unplanned pregnancy in that time. So don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to bash apps. I'm simply saying that they should be used as a tool to assist you, but to not abdicate responsibility of the awareness of your body to an app. Now, before I get into the really technical bits of the fertility awareness method, I really want to share with you benefits of the fertility awareness method outside of avoiding conception or trying to conceive and assisting with conception. The first one is the female cycle is an amazing feedback loop. It is literally feedback on how you are doing on a monthly basis. This is a wonderful book, but I also want to say I fully agree. The female cycle is a woman's fifth vital sign, as in a fifth sign for you to be able to get feedback on your health and on your general well-being. I'm probably going to make an entire video on things that my cycle has taught me, or things that I'm able to know about my health and my well-being through my cycle, but I'm just going to give a couple examples in this video. So the first one is my cycle has been able to tell me when I was stressing way too much that it was impacting my health. Beginning of last year, I was stressing so much and I was so overworked that for the first time in a long time, my ovulation delayed. And I could directly pinpoint it because I had just started my YouTube channel, and I could directly pinpoint it to the stress and the work that had come with that. So that was my body giving me a sign I was not working in a sustainable way. The second one, and I spoke about this in my pill video a lot, and why I started to really journal so much stuff about my health and my well-being, is because I had what I would deem pretty horrendous PMS. So I wanted to know if all of my efforts were making changes in terms of my health, because I was putting in a lot of effort into them, and sometimes we can't remember when something's changing or when it's not changing. So when I had my cycle as a feedback loop and when I was paying attention to that stuff, I could pick up on what was working and what was not working. This was specifically for my PMS, but there's a lot of other things that your cycle can tell you. And just because you have a bleed doesn't necessarily mean that you're ovulating. So you can have a bleed where you're not ovulating, and tracking your cycle will indicate to you whether or not you're ovulating. It will also be able to indicate a lot of other things regarding your hormones. And if you are using the fertility awareness method the way that we were, where we knew we wanted to conceive in a few years' time, but just didn't want to conceive, when we were using it, then when you have that feedback, you have a lot more time to address it, rather than only finding out about things when you really do want to conceive. And that can be quite an emotional journey, to feel that you're being set back by only discovering this now. So if, for example, you see through your cycle you've got low progesterone, or maybe you're not ovulating, you're able to take the time to focus on your hormonal health where you are not trying to get pregnant. But even if you literally never want to be pregnant, you just don't want to take hormonal birth control and you want to use this method to avoid conception until you no longer have a cycle, I think there are incredible health benefits, and I think that ovulating is a vitally important part of women's health. Again, I wouldn't focus on this just for the intention to conceive. I would focus on this for my general health and my general well-being. I am basing a lot of what I say on resources that I think are pretty credible and good sources of information. Specifically, a lot of what I learned about women's health comes from the book PMS to Menopause by Dr. Ray Peat. But also the book that I just showed you, The Fifth Vital Sign, is also an incredible resource to understand women's health better. I'd also like to add in here an incredibly personal experience to me when it came to my awareness of my cycle. So I've been doing this for quite a while, Specifically, a few years of daily manual journals, and then before this, about a year and a half of journaling it in an app. So my awareness of my cycle is, I would say, pretty good. And I also know what things indicate in my cycle. My cycle has been a type of a diagnostic tool for me. And that feedback that my cycle's given me is also an incredible gift to me. So the personal experience that I want to share with you is we had a pregnancy loss, a miscarriage. And I remember prior to when we found out what the reason was for that, obviously the doctor is trying to prevent me from having losses ever again, so kind of going through all of the things that it could be. And she mentioned that, maybe it's low progesterone, maybe we should look at putting you on a progesterone supplement. And even in a time that was really hectic, because that conversation happened right after we found out it was a miscarriage, and I remember being able to say to her very confidently, it's not low progesterone. And I know that because I know what the signs of low progesterone are in my cycle, and in any women's cycle really, and I know for a fact that I have never had signs of low progesterone. So 2 weeks later, we did get confirmation that it is most definitely not low progesterone or anything to do with my hormonal health, but it helped to know in those 2 weeks where we didn't have that confirmation, where a doctor was telling me that it was potentially low progesterone, and had I not had that information about my cycle, I probably would have been sitting there, thinking it was low progesterone for 2 weeks straight. So I had the wonderful gift of having that certainty that I don't know what caused it at that point, but that I knew it wasn't due to hormonal imbalances as a result of my health, because I knew that my cycle had given me feedback for so long that was indicating that there were no hormonal imbalances. So the gift of having that awareness of my cycle means that I can take that information to a doctor, and that they can then use their expertise and we can work together as a team. It also means that I can save a lot in terms of testing. Like I'm speaking now about money, and not run unnecessary tests that I've been able to rule out through just creating an awareness of my cycle. The other amazing benefit that came with an awareness of my cycle was the awareness that I was living as if I was a man operating on a 24-hour cycle, and I don't. I operate on more or less a 28-day cycle. It's not always 28 days, but I have phases that my body goes through. And when I go through these phases, so do my emotions, so does my concentration, so does my fitness and my strength and my needs and what I'm more focused on. It changes throughout this 28-day cycle, through the 4 phases of my cycle. And when I became aware of the pattern, when I journaled it and I could see that literally this is the phases that my body goes through and my mind goes through, it really enriched my way of living. And I was able to do exercise in a way that was working for my body, as opposed to getting frustrated that my body doesn't always have the same strength ability every single day of the month. And I could understand why my concentration levels would wax and wane, and I could understand why at certain times I was more sensitive to certain things, why I was more creative in that phase, why there were times where I would feel so loving and just want to make plans with everybody, and then a week later completely regret making those plans because I just feel like I really need to be internal. And before, those things were just seemed like random occurrences, but they aren't for me. And now that I have that awareness, I just feel like my whole life is a lot easier and just enriched by being able to do it in that pattern. Now, the final amazing benefit that I want to share, I'm sure there are more, but I'm going to share a final one to get to the technicalities of the fertility awareness method, is the final one is I learned through this method, it wasn't forced, it came on its own, to have incredible respect for my body and incredible respect for my cycle. Where before, I can honestly say, it was painful, it was frustrating, I would feel like it was just a lot. And I would feel like my body is punishing me, and it's so difficult being a woman, and it's harder, and all of that stuff. And I would have painful periods and be like, why do I have to go through this? See, I don't have painful periods anymore. thankfully. So instead of having a mindset of my body's trying to punish me, or my body's being difficult, or this is so frustrating, I now have this immense gratitude towards what my body does on a monthly basis, how it recovers, how it is telling me things, and how when I don't listen to it, it is going to scream louder. It is going to get more painful. It's going to get more uncomfortable because it is trying to tell me to change something. And I now see, and I didn't see it this way before, but now I see taking hormonal birth control or something that shuts down my cycle as the equivalent to kind of sticking a band-aid on a problem that's not going to go away without me addressing it, or sticking my fingers in my ears singing and trying to ignore the signs that my body is sending me. So now, even when I receive uncomfortable or painful signs from my body, I receive them with gratitude towards my body, thanking it for letting me know that it needs me to do something else. It needs me to be different or better towards it for my general health and my well-being. So I've had a total mindset shift towards my period and having a cycle and being a woman, and now I see it as this incredible gift to me that I have on a monthly basis. With that all being said, let's get into how. How do you do the fertility awareness method, really getting into the nitty-gritty practical things of how this happens or how you do it. So what will you need to be able to implement the fertility awareness method? Number 1, you need a thermometer. You do not need a fancy thermometer. You just need an accurate thermometer. You do not have to buy one that says basal body temperature thermometer. Any thermometer will be sufficient. I'm currently testing out a specifically basal body temperature thermometer to give you feedback on whether I think it's worth it to purchase the more expensive one. But what I can definitely say in this video so far is that for many years, for what now, like 3.5 years, I have used a normal thermometer very successfully. What I can also say about thermometers is I do not think that you need one that has Bluetooth linking to an app. First of all, I don't think it's a major inconvenience to type in your temperature every day or to write it down. But also I think if it's automated, it also breaks that awareness because you're not intentionally looking at it and adding it in. You're just shoving it in your mouth and you might check your app later. Whereas I intentionally look at my temperature every single day and then I write it down. So I internalize that information in the grander scheme of my cycle. And then the second thing that you need is you need some way to document the information. There are various options for how you can do that. The first one that I used to use is an app. There are many different apps available, so you can kind of try out them and see which one works the best for you. I currently, like I showed, do a physical written journal. I found that that works best for me. I will make a video comparing the two and their pros and cons because I think both of them have pros and cons. I just find that writing it is my preferred method, but that's not necessarily true for everybody else. And I did use an app for about 1.5 years and now I've used my written journal. So I've done both. Also, you don't have to do an app and my kind of freehand written journal that I use. You can also find online ways to print out a fertility awareness chart and then you fill it in a chart. I don't like to fill out a chart because I like to fill out detailed information about my well-being and my health and my physical symptoms and supplements that I take and things that I do. So I like a lot more detail than a chart provides. But if you're simply using the fertility awareness method to conceive or to avoid conception, that's your main focus, then it's wonderful because it depicts it really well. And you can just focus on where's my fertile window and where's my not fertile window. All I will say that's important is find a way that works for you. Change it if it doesn't work for you. Find a way that really nicely depicts the temperature graph in the beginning, especially that's, I think, very helpful to be able to visually see it. Now I don't need to visually see it anymore because I know what my temperature should be at different phases. The only reason I sometimes put it into an app is to show on my Instagram when I speak about it. The third thing that you need, a plan for what you're going to do in that fertile window. And this is something I feel nobody ever talks about, except obviously in the books about fertility awareness to talk about this, but I've never seen this spoken about on YouTube videos. And it's really an important practical part of this, is you need to do something in that fertile window not to get pregnant. You can't just have an awareness of it. I mean, having the awareness means you know you can get pregnant in that window. So I'm going to share a little bit of information on various ways that you can prevent sperm from being in your vagina during your fertile period. The first one is the most obvious one, but it is not very appealing to me, is to simply abstain. And maybe some couples want to do this in the beginning when you're getting the hang of it. Perfectly fine if you want to do that always, but it didn't appeal to me to completely abstain for like a week or more in a cycle. But I mean, I can also see theoretically why abstaining for a specific period of time can actually enhance intimacy in a way. It just, again, didn't appeal to me. The second one is also not one that I use, but I know lots of other people who use this one, and that is the withdrawal method. I think the name explains what that entails. Now, this is where I start to say that, remember I said how effective this method is up to you. So you can determine how effective it is based on what strategy you use during the fertile period. Personally, the withdrawal one is a little risky for my liking, but I know lots of people use it successfully and they feel completely comfortable with it. That's fine. My level of risk, or how I determine it to be risky, is different from somebody else's. So the second reason that the withdrawal method does not appeal to me is just because practically I think it can be quite a break in intimacy. But I think the main reason is it's quite dependent on, you know, user error there, as well as just to some degree there can be sperm in fluid that comes out prior to ejaculation. That being said, I'm not overly worried about that because first of all, that happening is, what I've read, quite a rare occurrence. And then aside from that, even if you do time it perfectly and somehow there was fluid, your chances of two healthy people conceiving every single cycle is also not 100%. It is around, currently the stats that were told to me, is around 20 to 25% each cycle. And then you're still looking at about a 70% likelihood that that conception may terminate. So if we're looking at how easy it is to get pregnant, it's not very easy. But again, if that's not something you want, the risk isn't necessarily worth it. But that's something you need to determine, whether you feel comfortable with the withdrawal method or not, and whether that in terms of intimacy works for you and your partner or not. Personally, we just opted not to use that one, but no hate to it. Then the third one, and I think this is probably the most popular one, is the barrier method. So you put a barrier between the sperm and the vagina. I think that also implies what I mean with that. But if it doesn't, to state it plainly, I'm referring to either male or female condoms. This one is quite a preferred method in terms of when you're still getting the hang of it, and you might want to keep your kind of activity around the fertile window large to make sure that you don't by accidentally go in the fertile window. This one may be a nice option. If you are concerned, like I really care about the ingredients in certain products, if you're concerned about the ingredients in, for example, lubricant, I have recently seen, I haven't used any of them so can't give feedback, but I have recently seen you can get natural condoms that have natural lubricants on them if latex and generally manufactured lubricant is not something that you want to use. Then number 4, and this one, I don't know anybody who's used this, I have never used this, but I've read about it, is spermicide. So yeah, I don't know anything about spermicide, but theoretically it just doesn't appeal to me. I think just the name is a bit off-putting for me. It sounds like I'm putting pesticides in my vagina. Anyway, the point is there are options, and I think the important thing is that it is person and couple specific what you want to do. You need to decide what you want to do in terms of risk-taking, research, whatever method you decide to use, be comfortable with the failure rate of that method, because like I said, all contraceptives, all of them, except obviously abstaining, have a failure percentage. They all have some percentage where they're not successful at preventing conception. And you need to know that and be comfortable with whatever option you choose and make an informed decision. I don't think I have the answer for couples. What works for me and my husband does not necessarily work for anybody else, and that is important for couples to discuss that and to figure it out. However, I'd like to comment on a comment that I often get that is difficult for me to hear. And that is when people say to me, oh no, my husband would never want to use X, Y, and Z. Okay, I hear you, but hormonal birth control has side effects. Not potentially has side effects, it has side effects. And if you don't want to suppress your cycle and you don't want to run the risk of the very severe potential side effects, then I do think it's important, because contraceptive is a two-person problem, for you and your partner to have serious conversations around strategizing ways that work for both of you, as opposed to simply throwing out one of them because your partner isn't overly excited about that particular method. What I will say, because obviously I talk about this a lot, when I have spoken to people's partners where they had previously said to me, oh no, my partner would never be okay with that. When I had spoken to them about the realities of hormonal birth control and potentially what that could do to women and the benefits of living in sync with your cycle, oftentimes I would see their whole mannerism become quite eager to strategize with their partner around finding a way that works for both of you. To conclude, in whatever way you and your partner want to, if you're using the fertility awareness method not to conceive, to avoid pregnancy, then find a way to keep sperm from your vagina in your fertile window. Now, how to actually track. What are the markers that you use to create this awareness of your body to know when your fertile window is going to open and when it's going to close? I will make, because there's a lot of technicalities around this and I get a lot of different questions about the specific ones, so I will make a video dedicated to each one of them to explain abnormalities or questions that I get asked very often. But in this video, I'm just going to provide a overview of how they work so that you can start implementing it and start getting feedback about your body. So there are 3 primary markers. Of the 3 primary ones, there are lots of secondary ones, and you will discover what your secondary ones are. But of those 3 primary ones, I will explain all 3 in case you want to use all 3. So the 3 that there are is, the first one is the temperature. That's why you need the thermometer. The second one is cervical fluid. Remember my whole thing about how wonderful cervical fluid is. And the final one, the one that I don't use, is cervical position. Okay, then you're going to discover a whole bunch of secondary ones. Please let secondary ones be secondary ones, as in do not primarily rely on them. So for example, ovulation pain is a nice little obvious sign that ovulation is coming about. First of all, not everybody has that, and you won't have it every cycle. And also when you have it, it may move. It may not necessarily come before you ovulate. I've had it sometimes come when I ovulate or the day afterwards. So it would be a terrible one if I was primarily relying on that. But as a secondary one, it's quite nice to see it. I say pain, it's not really painful. It's more just like uncomfortable, or just like, ooh, ovulation feels. And if you are going to watch this video, and I know lots of people do this, so that's why I'm going to say this. If you watch this video and you decide to ignore what I've said or all of the markers, and you decide you're just gonna look at one of them, and I know that people do this, that's why I'm saying it. First of all, I wouldn't recommend that, but you know, I'm gonna say this anyway. If I were to throw out all of my other markers and it was just to use one to predict when my fertile window is opening and when my fertile window is closing, I would go by my cervical fluid. Lots of people go by temping, like temperature taking. It will tell you after the fact. It will not tell you before the time that your window is going to open, and then you will find out if it's a possibility that you could be pregnant that cycle or not through temping. But through your cervical fluid, you'd be able to have a heads up to say, oh, okay, the window's gonna open. Let's do whatever in the window. But ideally, please use at least 2 of the 3 primary ones, and then maybe add in some secondary ones to get a better understanding of your body. All right, so the how. You're going to track your cycle. Your cycle starts, the first day of your cycle is the first day of your period. That is the first day of red flowing blood out of your body. It's important for me to say this because lots of women might have a little bit of spotting prior to when your period starts. Spotting is not your period. Wait for the first day of red and take that as your first cycle day, not old blood. That brown stuff is old blood. That's not the first day of your cycle. So start counting from the first day of red. So we call that phase your winter, if you like to refer to them as their seasons, which I do, or it is your menstrual phase, your bleed. Literally your uterine lining, your uterus, its lining that it built up for potential implantation for pregnancy is shedding. That is partially what causes the blood. So you can imagine if your uterus is physically shedding, you cannot see how sperm can get in there and somehow make a baby. So typically your winter or your menstrual phase will last like 3 to 5 days, maybe even 7 days, depending on how long or short your period is. For me, it's about 3 days. Now, if somebody tells you you can get pregnant during your period, first of all, you cannot. Well, technically you cannot, but I'm going to explain the exceptions to that rule. The ways that you can get pregnant during what you think is a period is if you're bleeding, but it's not a period. If you are bleeding, but it's ovulation bleeding, that's obviously an abnormality. It happens to people, but it's not necessary that people bleed during ovulation. So sometimes people can mistake that for a period. Then you most definitely can get pregnant if you've mistaken your bleeding for a period where it's actually ovulation bleeding. Or a second thing is you've mistaken your bleeding and it's not actually a period, but it's implantation bleeding, as in you're already pregnant and you're bleeding a little bit from the fertilized egg implanting into your uterus. Then you are already pregnant, so you can't get more pregnant. And the last way that you can get pregnant when you are bleeding is if you have a very long bleed and your fertile window opens, almost literally like while you're kind of still spotting from your period, and it opens and you don't notice, and you have sex in that time where you didn't notice that it opened because you have a very long bleed. That is one way. So aside from that, I don't see how it is possible for you to get pregnant during your bleed phase. And just a reminder, if you randomly wanted to know this in terms of cervical fluid, the bleed phase, although there is obviously liquid, is considered a dry phase because there isn't cervical fluid during that phase. When you're done with your winter, out of your winter, you will come into your spring, and it's also known as your follicular phase. I think it's called that because it's the phase where your follicles are growing. This is my absolute favorite phase. I know that I'm not supposed to have like a preference, but I do. I have lots of energy in this phase. I feel very creative. I feel so excited about life. I literally feel like spring in this phase. However, this phase is important because this is the phase where I need to know when my window is going to open, because it's going to open in my follicular phase. So what happens in your follicular phase is that lining is starting to build up in preparation for ovulation, in preparation for an egg coming down to be fertilized to implant, and that's how pregnancy happens. If you don't want it to happen, then don't have sex in a way that sperm is in your vagina in your fertile window. In this phase, your temperatures are likely to be pretty low because your progesterone levels are low. So for me, currently they're usually around 36.5 degrees Celsius or lower. Anything higher than that would be like a weird abnormality in this phase, or if I woke up late. Generally 36.5 degrees Celsius or lower for me, follicular phase. Now it's going to stay low. It might have an ovulation dip, but that's rare and doesn't happen every cycle until I ovulate, and then it will go up. So that's why temperature is not a good sign, because I will only know when it starts to go up that I've already ovulated. So how will I know that my fertile window is opening? Is I will know through my cervical fluid. There will come a time, they call it point of change in your cycle, where it will go from dry. Remember I said the menstrual phase is dry, so that means there's no cervical fluid. Then suddenly you will start to feel or see cervical fluid. And that is an indication your fertile window is opening. So as soon as you see cervical fluid, I would recommend starting to implement whatever method it is that you're going to implement in your fertile window to be on the safe side. Now, I know that there are some resources that say any cervical fluid is fertile and can make a baby, but yeah, I don't think that's entirely accurate. But when you're using the fertility awareness to prevent conception, I think that's more relevant for people trying to conceive. But when you're using it to prevent conception, assume that all cervical fluid is fertile, because it will turn from not fertile to fertile pretty quickly. Okay, so for me, how this generally plays out, but again, don't count days. So don't assume that because it's happened like this on the one cycle, it's going to happen like this on the next cycle. Because like I've shown on my Instagram, that can be thrown off pretty easily. But how this generally happens for me is I have my kind of 3 or 4 days maybe of my menstrual phase, then I enter my wonderful follicular phase, and then around 8th day of my cycle, I'll get my point and change, where I will, for the first time that cycle, start seeing cervical fluid. Mine will start off as like white and creamy, and then it will turn to fertile cervical fluid, which looks like egg white. And it's long and stretchy, it's not like rubbery or creamy. I think like the best way to remember that it's fertile is it looks a lot like sperm, which makes sense because it's part of the process of making sperm into the form that can fertilize an egg. So usually on about day 11 or day 12 of my cycle, I will get my super fertile cervical fluid, and then as soon as I've ovulated, that will kind of dry up within a day. I think cervical fluid is the most accurate way to tell when your window is going to open and when it has closed, because your cervical fluid will dry up. You may experience, like I said, an ovulation dip in your temperatures, but that would be extremely risky to wait for that, because in all of my cycles of tracking, which is a lot, it's years, I've experienced it, a handful of times, and I usually only see it backwards. I only see like after a week or so past ovulation, I see, oh, okay, there, like it dipped a little bit, but it's not something that I would rely on. A secondary sign that you can use in this phase, if you'd want to, is the use of LH tests, but just a word of caution to not solely rely on them. First of all, if you're preventing pregnancy, it's going to be terrible because you get that surge right before you ovulate, which means sperm could have been kept alive by your cervical fluid for a few days before you get your positive LH test. Then the other thing is an LH surge doesn't necessarily mean that you do ovulate. You can still, I think it's a good idea to confirm ovulation through your temperature and through drying up of cervical fluid. And the other thing, and this is probably a good thing to play around with, so I played around with LH tests lots before we were trying to conceive. I would take them at different points in my cycle to see what my LH levels, but there are some hormonal conditions, or there are some conditions that can result in having LH spikes throughout your cycle, and you might want to be aware of that. So you might want to play around with LH tests just to get a gauge of, like, I played around with it to see how long is my LH surge. So I would like take them every few hours to document how long it is. But I mean, that was just fun extra information that I wanted. Okay, then your next phase is ovulation. Ovulation isn't really like a phase. It's more like a day, but I kind of take my whole fertile phase as my ovulation phase, even though it's technically just a day. How you will know you're ovulating is you know it from what's coming, so the cervical fluid kind of opening up that window, and then you confirm it after the fact once you've entered into your luteal phase. So there isn't like a clear, obvious, hey, I'm ovulating right this second. There are signs before and there are signs after that you use. Once you've ovulated, your cervical fluid should dry up pretty quickly. I often get this question of like, how do I check my cervical fluid? I can make a detailed video on that, but I think the easiest way to do it is to check when you go to the bathroom. And probably preferably when you make a bowel movement, because then there's like a lot going on and a lot coming out your body. So you're more likely to see cervical fluid in that time. But just take a bit of toilet paper and wipe in that area only. Don't wipe the whole area, because then you're going to get other stuff. And do that as like a routine when you go to the bathroom until you kind of get the hang of it. I think that would be the easiest way. Okay, and then once you've ovulated, ovulation triggers your body to tell you that, okay, cool, we've ovulated now, make progesterone. Make progesterone in case we're pregnant, but also progesterone is amazing for women's health. So I just like that progesterone irrespective. The progesterone comes from the corpus luteum, the cyst that's created after ovulation. So don't think that the word I have cysts on a scan is necessarily a bad thing. You can sometimes have a very healthy, very normal, very needed cyst, and it is the thing producing progesterone in your body as normal part of the cycle. And when that thing is there, it is called the luteal phase. It's named after that cyst. The time between ovulation and your next cycle starting, so your next bleed, is called your luteal phase, and it's generally about 12 to 14 days. How you know you've entered that phase is progesterone will cause a spike in your temperatures, or it's supposed to. So one of the feedback loops that you can get is if you're not seeing a nice little temperature jump, that's information about your cycle coming back to you and about your hormones. But generally what you're hoping to see there is a nice jump between your follicular phase temperatures, your ovulation temperatures, and your luteal phase temperatures. And you'll see it on a graph jump up like that. If you've got about 3 days of high temperatures in a row, you can pretty much confirm that you have ovulated. One temperature jump is not necessarily enough because you can get like outliers with your temperature. But if you want to confirm it, wait for the 3 raised temperatures in a row, but it will generally stay elevated throughout your luteal phase and then drop right before your period. So sometimes when I take my temperature in the morning, I know my period's going to come later that day because my temperature's dropped. But sometimes also, depending on how high your progesterone levels went, you can maybe still have a high temperature and a drop like the day after your period. So when people say they have a long cycle, that probably means it's longer than, the average like 28 to 30 day type cycles. If you have a long cycle, the thing that is long is not your luteal phase, because you will always have around 12 to 14 days between ovulation and period. Ovulation doesn't happen halfway through your cycle. It happens, and then about 2 weeks later, you should expect your period. So if you have a long cycle, either what could have happened is you didn't ovulate and eventually the lining gets so heavy it just sheds, or your ovulation was moved and you had a really long follicular phase and then only did you ovulate, and then you have 2 weeks later, you have your bleed. So again, this is kind of information that your cycle will be giving you. If you track ovulation, you'll know, why is my cycle longer or why is my cycle shorter? One thing I want to say, just so that this doesn't scare you, and that's why I don't like it when people say all cervical fluid is fertile, is during your luteal phase, you might get like some white stuff coming out of your body, but that isn't cervical fluid. It's just like part of the vagina function, and it releases some fluids to help keep it bacteria free. During your luteal phase, your cervix is plugged. So you're not going to be getting cervical fluid, but you might still see fluid. It generally should be white. If it's not white, then, it could be some other kind of fluid going on there. So if it is just a little bit of white, then that's just part of the normal cleaning process of the vagina, and it's not cervical fluid. So you don't have to be worried that that's the kind of fluid that's going to lead to a pregnancy. Okay, and then when your luteal phase has ended, you will bleed again, and that will start a new cycle. And that is the 4 phases of your menstrual cycle. Your bleed phase, which is your winter, then you'll go into your follicular phase because your follicles are growing, which is your spring. Then your follicles will burst, and one of them will burst and release an egg, which is your ovulation phase, also known as your summer. Then you will enter into your luteal phase, or your autumn, where you will have the cyst that's producing progesterone, and then you'll start a new cycle. So with each phase, you will want to be aware of the different things that happen for you in that cycle. If you're doing fertility awareness, to have a general awareness and to live in sync with your cycle. If you are doing it to avoid pregnancy or to conceive, you really want to focus on the physical signs, so your cervical fluid, your cervical position, your temperatures, and then any other secondary signs like an LH test and or like ovulation feels. So just a quick word on your cervical position. It moves during your cycle, and it goes from a little bit softer to more hard, and it will move like physically up and down in your body. And when you are fertile, generally you can expect it to be softer and more open. And then, like I said, your cervix plugs in your luteal phase, which it will be a little bit harder. So I will make a video on cervical position, but it will be a theoretical video from my perspective because I don't use my cervical position as a marker. The reason that I don't use it is I just don't find it that practical because, you know, it would require like that physical activity of checking it every single day. But the other reason, and if you've ever watched my video on menstrual cups, you will have a little giggle at my kind of difficulty with menstrual cups, but my cervix is really high even when it's low. So it's just not that practical for me to be trying to dig around there to feel my cervix on a daily basis. Maybe in future I will go through that effort so that I can make a video to talk about the practicalities of it, but for now I can just speak of it theoretically. And theoretically, what you want to feel, apparently it feels like the kind of, actually I have felt my cervix before, so I do know that it does feel like, you know, the tip of your nose. And then throughout your cycle you will feel changes and you can record those changes and then you can kind of get an indication of what's going on. Okay, so just a quick recap. Menstrual phase, not fertile. Follicular phase, you're potentially going to be fertile and your window is going to open. Ovulation, most definitely fertile. Luteal phase, confirm that window has closed and then not fertile. When you are starting to do fertility awareness, I would recommend being quite risk averse, or at least I was. So the area either side of my fertile window was rather large, just so that I could get comfortable that I am doing it accurately. The more comfortable I became, the smaller that window became. And now, even though we are actively avoiding conception right now as well, that window is pretty small because I'm pretty comfortable with my understanding of my body. But also, I'm pretty comfortable with the risk that I'm taking. So that's the beauty of this method, is that the risk is in your hands. So for me, currently, my window where I would implement some other kind of method is about 6 days. 6 days of an entire cycle is my fertile window, and the rest of the time, I'm not worried about pregnancy happening. To conclude this video, I quickly want to go over some frequently asked questions or comments that I receive about this method, and then that's going to be the conclusion, but you can expect in future that I will make more detailed videos about every element of it, just to give you a bit more information that's hopefully helpful. But comment down below questions that you have or comments that you have that you want me to address, or specific things you want to kind of brainstorm or just have more information on. So the first one I need to give you a heads up about is the comments from people is a bit ridiculous. Like, I don't know why people feel the need to make these comments. Okay, no, I'm joking, I know why, but that's just like a saying. The thing is, I got a lot of comments, and I know that other people get these comments of like, oh, okay, I'll get the nappies ready, or like, how many times a doctor or somebody said this to me where they were like, oh, okay, so you don't mind getting pregnant then. As if this is not a real method, as if this is not a real way of preventing pregnancy. And I have successfully used it for 3 years. Yet I still get those comments. And the thing is, those comments come from people who don't understand the method, who assume that you are doing some kind of just rhythm method or just counting days or just slotting your period into an app. But having a genuine awareness of your body is very different from that. So the reason I want to say this is because I understand that it can be pretty scary when everybody's doubting your contraceptive method, because it might still be scary for you, and then to also hear all of these doubts from other people, it can lead you to have more doubts or maybe think that it's not an effective method of contraceptive. I just want to say that those comments don't come from people who understand the method properly, and people who do understand the method generally don't make those comments. But ultimately, it is your body, it is your decision, and this information is to empower you to decide whether this is the right method for you or not. And I do hope that the thing deterring you from it isn't other people's comments where they don't understand the method. So if you're going to be deterred from it, be deterred because you look at it and you're like, no, that's not for me. As opposed to, no, it's scary because my doctor made a comment about it. So I know some people who go to the gynecologist and just lie about they're trying to not be pregnant, but they just say, yeah, no, I'm trying to get pregnant, just so that they won't be questioned about why they aren't taking any hormonal birth control. And that is really sad for me, that the conversation in a doctor's office has gotten to the point that people would rather lie than hear the comments about their choice of contraceptive. So my hope is that obviously information about this will spread and it will get to a point where women don't have to deal with those comments, that it is accepted as a proper way of contraceptive because it is an effective contraceptive method. So until such time as there aren't those comments around it anymore, which I don't think we're that far off. If I can just looking at how popular this method is becoming, I really don't think we're that far off from people not making those comments. But until such time, you can channel my confidence with it if you would like to, or the best thing is to just empower yourself to feel comfortable, to advocate for your health, for your body, and for the decision that you're making for you, and to not falter on that when other people have concerns, and to not internalize their fears. The second comment, and I briefly addressed this at the start of the video, is the whole like, oh yeah, but so-and-so got pregnant. First of all, fertility awareness is often confused with the rhythm method. It is often confused with people simply putting their period into an app and having the app tell them when they're ovulating or not. I'm not saying so-and-so did or didn't get pregnant doing that. I'm just saying that some of the people that I know who did get pregnant where it was perceived that they were doing fertility awareness method were just doing the rhythm method. The second thing is that there is a lot of shame in society around unplanned pregnancies. So people don't necessarily feel comfortable to be honest about how exactly they got pregnant. So a lot of the times the version that the public hears versus what actually happened is a little bit different, just because people can be quite judgy. I think if as a society, if we're a little bit more kind and less shameful to women who have and men who have unplanned pregnancies, maybe there wouldn't be so much misperceptions around how easy or difficult it is to get pregnant. That being said, unplanned pregnancies do happen, and the reality is if you are deciding to have sex, there's a chance you can get pregnant, always, with every single type of contraceptive. I personally am an IUD baby, so IUDs are supposed to be very effective at preventing pregnancy, and they clearly were not. There are other people who are pill babies, there are other people who are babies from the injections. So every single contraceptive method has an effective rate, so they give you a percentage of how effective it is, and all of them have a failure rate. It's a risk you take when you decide to have sex. So the fertility awareness method, like all other contraceptive, is not 100%. It obviously worked really well for us, but there is still a chance that it could not work. But what I like about it is that the risk is in your hands and you can decide how big or how small of a risk you want to take with it. Comment number 3 that I get, people are like, no, I can't do this because I have polycystic ovarian syndrome, or no, I can't do this because I have endometriosis. I have to be on whatever birth control. First of all, you don't have to do anything. It's your body, it's your decision, it's your choice. Whatever medication you take is because you are choosing to do so. It's not a have to. And I do understand that having those conditions, because I have a lot of empathy for that, can complicate things severely. But there are sufficient resources to show that you can successfully implement the fertility awareness method and maintain hormonal health through not being on specific medications. And using this method, it is just a little bit more complicated. Specifically for polycystic ovarian syndrome, where if you have irregular cycles, it's going to make fertility awareness more difficult, but it's not possible. It's also, I think, quite helpful if you have irregular cycles to try and determine whether you are or aren't ovulating. Are your cycles irregular because you ovulate very late, or are they irregular because you're not ovulating at all? Are they irregular because sometimes your luteal phase is really short and you're not sustaining your lining with progesterone? So I think that the fertility method can give you a feedback loop to that. But obviously having a condition like that does mean that the decision is yours to decide whether you want to be off of that medication and to implement this or not. So just to answer a question I do sometimes get is, can I implement this while I'm on hormonal birth control? And that answer is no, because you won't have a cycle. So if you are taking any kind of hormonal supplements that shuts down your cycle, pretty much most hormonal contraceptives you are not able to implement the fertility awareness method. Comment number 4, and the final comment that I'm going to do in this video, is where people tell me, oh no, I can't do that. That just takes like way too much time. It's way too much effort. Like I don't want to go through all of that effort. I don't know how else to say this other than that it's really not a lot of effort. So people look at me and they say, oh my goodness, no, that's way too intense. Like I would never want to read all of that information and do all of that research. You don't have to do all of those things. I do those things because I want to, not because I need to do them in terms of fertility awareness. Just implementing the fertility awareness method is pretty easy once you get the hang of it. Does it take a little bit of time getting used to it? Does it take a little bit of knowing your body and knowing your cycle? Sure. But that information is incredibly valuable for more than just avoiding conception or conceiving. So in my opinion, worth knowing that. But once you've got the hang of it, it takes less than like, okay, sometimes your thermometer can take like a minute or two to show you your temperature. And then it literally takes like a minute or two to jot it down and have a look at it. I've explained extensively in this video why I think it's generally life enriching and for me worth every little bit of effort I put into it. I do a more extended version of the fertility awareness method where I do a detailed journal every single day, and I have done so for like I've only done for like 3 years. But even with doing a more detailed approach, it doesn't take me longer than 5 or 10 minutes every single day. So the more effort you put into it, the more the reward is going to be for you. So if you don't want to put in a lot of effort and you just want the basics of how to avoid conception, that's definitely possible to do so easily. If, like me, you want to use it for general hormonal health or preparing, I used it as part of preconception. I made a preconception video as well. Then you might want to do a little bit more and look more into hormonal health, but that's definitely not a requirement of the fertility awareness method. Okay, and this is a great time to stop because we have lost daylight and this video is, I think, quite long. So if you've made it all the way through, thank you for journeying with me. I hope that this information has been valuable for you. I hope to bring you more valuable information on the cycle in future, so comment down below what exactly you want me to make videos about or what information you think will be helpful for you. And if you found this helpful, just remember to like and subscribe to my channel.